Welcome back to our velocity-based training series brought to you by GymAware. And today is our Module 10, final module for this series, and we're going to delve into monitoring fatigue and readiness. It is a question that comes up a lot. It's very popular in a lot of research, but also generally for people that are in pro sport, they get asked a lot about how do they measure whether their athletes are ready to train, or how do we monitor fatigue and the accumulation of fatigue over time. Now, I did briefly mention in previous modules around using velocity-based training as a readiness tool on the day, as an acute readiness tool to understand whether or not we're going to go for our 2RM, 3RM. You can start to see the velocity drop or decrement to understand whether the athlete on that day is fatigued, whether they're obviously ready to go for a PB. So there's still a little bit of that acute measurement, but we also want to start to have a bit of a chronic understanding of how an athlete is tolerating load. And it is very commonly done with force plates as a key measure, but using a GymAware unit or a velocity-based training system to have a really good measure of velocity outcome is fantastic and very portable and far more affordable in a lot of cases. So if we take a bit of a look of the most common ways that we start to measure readiness or monitoring fatigue in a team sport environment in particular, but obviously can be done in individual sports as well, is usually on a key training day, potentially once a week. They'll look at something like a counter movement jump, a repeated jump measure, a drop jump measure, something that can ascertain a bit of an understanding of what the central nervous system is doing and how fatigued it is and how it is responding to the current training load. Now, there's simple things out there like grip strengths as well that can be done, but when we start to look at the more sensitive measures, one, we need to make sure that we can replicate it and we can repeat it at a similar day, similar time, under similar conditions, so we can be accurate with our trend. But we also want a machine to monitor it accurately and know that we're getting really quality data. So using velocity can be a fantastic way to do that. We can either use the raw velocity output, or we can start to extrapolate it based off height measurements as well. Now, when we're doing height jumps or any type of basic bodyweight jumping, we've spoken about using either a dowel rod on the back that we can attach the GymAware unit to, a GymAware belt that we can attach to the unit to as well. Otherwise, we can start to have loaded jumps or a series of loaded jumps to look at how the decrement in velocity occurs at that time. But I can tell you right now, doing a series of jumps is quite hard to do with any athlete on a regular basis. It's far easier to just have 1 to 2 key counter movement jumps or drop jumps or something simpler to be able to ascertain where they're at for that day. We want to make it simple. We want to make it quick and easy for the athlete. So what we can look at doing is using the GymAware unit for a velocity measure or height measure. We can do a basic counter movement jump, maybe a series of them, as in 3 to 4 to make sure we get the best result. But ultimately, we can track that over time using whatever metric. In this case, I'm using velocity as the example. And we start to build up these data points. So it might be every Wednesday morning before main training. And in saying that, some people will do it all key training sessions. So it might be a Monday, Wednesday, Friday test as well. But ultimately, as a bare minimum, getting once a week is going to be key. So if this is each of our weeks leading on, we can start to see that this athlete starts to measure pretty consistently across the weeks for this measurement. What we start to see then is this sort of almost warning sign here where we see these 3 steady drop-offs, and obviously this 4th one down here continues the trend. Now, if I'm running a group where I see a trend like this is my sign as a coach to start to look at how can I start to manipulate training, modify it to have a bit of a rebound effect. Now, that may be reduction of total training load. It may be a reduction in acute training load on that day. At the end of the day, it is just a piece of the puzzle, and we need to understand what this type of metric then relates to with our training loads. Because if I know that my group is going to go under a lot of high stress, a lot of large training loads over these weeks, I would expect my group to do this. Just because my group or an individual is doing that does not make it a bad thing. But when I use it as a velocity measure, if I'm using a GymAware unit, I can start to say, well, my group is responding to the stimulus that I planned. And that in itself is a huge win as a coach to understand that. In the inverse, if we start to see training load decrease, in which case I would expect my athletes to do this, and one of my athletes is doing this, well, that is a big red flag for us. That is something that I can actually make a decision off, whether that be reduced training load or in which case might be more recovery, more treatment, whatever they might need. But we need to understand not just what is happening with the velocity drop with the individual athlete, but what is happening in relation to the training load. So one of my favorite ways to do that is to have this type of data overlaid with my loading data so I can actually see the trend. Because if my load is going up and my readiness is going down, I'm usually pretty happy with that. If my load is going down and my readiness is going up, again, that's a big win. But when we start to get the inverse, where I may be deloading, but then I start to see this readiness drop and drop and drop, that is a big red flag for me. When an athlete goes against the grain, we want to identify why. Now, that doesn't mean I suddenly jump and pull them out of every training session and put them into physio, but it does mean that I need to probably start to have the conversation with the individual, with the coaches, maybe reassess what their training load looks like, maybe their speeds have changed, maybe their volumes have changed inadvertently. So the benefit of using something like a GymAware unit is it's very portable, very easy to take with you. You can obviously use it at the facility or your main training location, but if you're working in an environment, say something like rugby sevens, where they have a lot of international travel, often training in various locations, it is really hard to take some equipment with you for testing. But something like a GymAware unit or multiple GymAware units, very easy, very transportable to make sure that this data is consistent, reliable and repeatable, so you can actually make accurate decisions off it, not just guessing whether or not your athlete is fatigued or ready to train. After 10 modules in this series, I really appreciate your attention. Hopefully there's been some great takeaways in regards to how to use velocity-based training. Some cases, depending on your experience, there may have been a lot of new things. For some people, there may have just been a reaffirmation of what they're currently doing and maybe a slight tweak on how they're applying things. Either way, hopefully there's some great takeaways for you. And please, if GymAware is something you're interested in, reach out to the guys at GymAware. They're always happy to help. Great humans, great company, and fantastic to partner with them to bring you this series and hopefully a couple more series in the future.